Today we've gathered to advance the conversation on global sustainability and to hear about solutions to resource scarcity, urbanization, transportation modernization, finance and investment, and other compelling issues currently facing our movement worldwide. It sounds like you've already been engaging in discussion and making good use of your presenters' expertise today. As we transition into the afternoon sessions, I hope you'll take the time to get to know those around you and further reflect on today's objectives. I want to thank you all for being here. Please enjoy your lunch and your table conversation. We will begin our luncheon program shortly. Thank you. So I'm delighted to introduce our plenary luncheon speaker, who represents a global business that has been a leading voice in sustainability for decades. Bob Mcdonough is president of United Technologies Climate Controls and Security, which provides heating, air conditioning, and refrigeration systems, building controls and automation, and fire and security systems to the global building industry. He was named to his current role in September, following a series of leadership roles within the organization. Bob has extensive experience in the building industry and previously served as chairman of AHRI, the Air Conditioning, Heating, and Refrigeration Institute. Bob and United Technologies have seen the value in green buildings for more than 20 years. The company's solutions lead to safer, smarter, sustainable, and high-performance buildings. Carrier played an important role in launching the U.S. Green Building Council back in 1993 and was the first company to join our organization. Carrier is also a founding member of the U.S., India, Argentina, China, Singapore, Kuwait, and France Green Building Councils, the only company in the world to hold that designation. And in 2010, United Technologies became the founding sponsor of the Center for Green Schools. As we look to the future of green buildings, the leadership of organizations like UTC will be instrumental. Please join me now in welcoming Bob Mcdonough to share new research findings with us.
Thank you, Peter, for that very kind introduction. I'm pleased and honored to be here to connect with those driving green buildings around the world. Today, I'll share the state of the green building globally. You'll see this segment is rapidly growing, driven by value and sound business decisions. We have attendees from over 30 countries today, truly representative of the broad reach of the green building movement. And as Peter noted, this is the 8th International Summit, and United Technologies is proud to have been the sponsor of all of them. So today's comments. I've got comments and exciting new research results to share with you. These results show the great strides that we continue to make in the green building space and the opportunities ahead. I'm going to highlight just a few high-level findings today, and then the complete research results will be available in January, with more detailed data on region-specific and country-by-country basis. But we're excited to share with you today some of the high-level findings. For background, my company, United Technologies, teamed with Dodge Data and Analytics to conduct the 2016 World Green Building Trends Survey. This study builds upon similar research from 2008 and 2012. Those of us in the room already know the importance of green buildings, but for us at United Technologies, we feel it's critical for building industry professionals to have the latest data and trends to inform their designs and decisions. This information is valuable as we look to accelerate buildings that will foster sustainable, healthy environments. That's why we supported this latest research effort, because ultimately, what gets measured gets improved. Our World Green Building Trends Survey was conducted from May to September of this year. There were more than 1,000 participants representing 69 countries. Compared to past surveys, there were more participants, but also much broader representation from across the building industry, including architects, engineers, contractors, owners, and consultants. Also, in comparison to previous surveys, fewer respondents were members of green building councils. Now, somewhat counterintuitively, well, actually, intuitively, you'd think that might point to less promising results, but in fact, that's not the case. The positive trends and the momentum remain strong, and this broader group of participants reflects the more extensive engagement with green buildings around the world. The most important single takeaway from the study is that green building is growing around the world and continues to double every 3 years. We see the rate of acceleration differs by region, with measured growth in mature economies and dramatic growth in developing markets. Across all the regions studied, respondents estimated that more than 60% of their projects would be green projects by 2018, with a doubling from current projects across the Middle East, North Africa, Asia, South America, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Not surprisingly, we continue to see the most green activity projected in new commercial buildings, followed by new institutional buildings, such as schools, hospitals, and public buildings, and then existing building projects or retrofits. So what's driving the continued growth of green buildings around the world? Let's have a look at some of the key trends and key drivers. Increasingly, clients and tenants are demanding sustainability. They want to live and work in spaces that offer natural lighting, use fewer resources, and provide better air quality. Collectively, this creates a pull from the broader building market. So green building isn't just an asset, it's becoming a necessity. Also, environmental regulations are cited consistently as a key driver for green building growth, particularly in the United Kingdom, India, and Singapore. This underscores the need for us to support responsible, economically logical regulation that will drive sustainability, particularly in emerging economies. Respondents were also motivated by the desire to create healthier neighborhoods. 15% cited it as important. Green neighborhoods start with green buildings, so this is a positive new trend that we saw in the 2015 survey. Now, in the foundational survey in 2008, more than 40% of respondents said that green building activity was increasing because it's simply the right thing to do. That intangible claim has dropped to below 25%, and this is because the industry is recognizing the real benefits of green buildings. Now, I'll stop here and note, I think, the importance of this new development, because for me, this begins to demonstrate the growing maturity of the green buildings movement. In my view, an over-reliance on an evangelical approach or an over-reliance on a commitment to environmental or social conscience, while admirable in their own right, are not enough to drive long-term success. Real, tangible economic value will be the key driver for investment decisions in buildings. And the growing body of evidence that influencers and decision makers see the economic value in green buildings is truly an encouraging trend, and one that's clearly pointed out in our survey. Now, of course, there are social reasons that continue to drive the green building movement. The most important, according to our study, is the belief that green buildings encourage sustainable business practices. Additionally, half of respondents noted that an increase in worker productivity is itself an important social driver. On the subject of productivity, and a related note, UTC has recently partnered with Harvard, State University of New York, and Syracuse University to explore the connection between green buildings and cognitive performance, particularly around the area of improved building ventilation. More information on those study results will be shared during an educational session this Friday and in the closing plenary. And we believe you'll find those results to be pretty compelling set of new information. Of course, there are environmental reasons for choosing green buildings. Reducing energy consumption continues to be the #1 driver. But we've also seen an increase in the desire to reduce water consumption and to protect natural resources by choosing green buildings. So that's a few of the key drivers behind the increase in green building. But what about the barriers to continued increase? Half of our survey respondents noted higher actual and perceived cost as the top barrier to green building, although this barrier has continually shrunk from the 2008 baseline, as you can see in the chart here. Other than cost, the top barriers to green building differ by country. In general, developing countries regard the lack of public awareness and the lack of political support as key inhibitors, and it's clear that these two factors go hand in hand. So we still have work to do to address and break down barriers to green building, and when the full results of the study are released in January, information will be available on a country-specific basis, giving us a roadmap to continue accelerating green buildings globally. So while some barriers do remain, the industry does recognize the tangible benefits of green buildings. Roughly 70% of our survey respondents cite lower operating cost as the greatest benefit of green buildings. But taking a closer look at the connection, nearly 70% of respondents anticipate that the operating cost of their new green buildings will decline measurably, in some cases more than 15% from their previous baseline. We also know that building owners and developers anticipate an increased value in their green buildings. 24% of owners and developers expect new green buildings will increase in value more than 10% over a non-green building over the same time period. And when it comes to existing buildings, nearly half of those involved in green retrofits report payback on their investments in 5 years or less, which is really an impressive statistic when you think about it. Finally, I'd close by saying we know that as building owners increase their focus on sustainability, the market for green buildings will continue to grow. And it becomes a cycle as building owners seek to create healthy, productive environments as a selling point to tenants. So we see green building growth accelerating globally based on value and sound business decisions. This gives me the confidence and the hope that we're well positioned in the building industry for a sustainable future. A lot of people in this room are responsible for that. We appreciate your passion, your leadership, and your knowledge. And thank you for doing your part. Thank you for being here. I appreciate you listening to my comments.
Thank you, Bob, for sharing that very, very important data set that helps guide where this movement is going. My name is John Mandyke. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer for United Technologies, and I'm really thrilled to introduce our keynote speaker for our lunch today. I've known our keynote speaker and admired and respected him for many, many years. Dr. Dan Reifsnyder is currently the co-chair of the ad hoc working group on the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's a really fancy way of saying he's co-chairing the climate talks leading up to COP21 next month. There are few people with the insight, the knowledge, and maybe the compass for the current state of climate negotiations than Dan. He just returned from Paris mid last week, and he's returning to Paris on Monday, where he will stay through the duration, helping the world negotiate this very, very important treaty. Given that we are just weeks away, we are truly grateful, Dan, that you've taken time from your really hectic schedule to join us today. Before his role with the UN Climate Convention, Dr. Reifsnyder served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Environment at the U.S. State Department. He was responsible for U.S. engagement across a broad range of environmental issues, conservation, water, and of course, global climate change. In these areas, he led the United States delegations to many treaties and bilateral agreements, including the Montreal Protocol, where I spent many a meeting watching Dan skillfully advance international policies to protect our ozone layer. He earned his PhD in international relations from Tufts University's Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He holds a law degree from George Washington University, a master's degree in Russian area studies from Georgetown University, and a bachelor's degree in political philosophy from Trinity College in my hometown of Hartford, Connecticut. We're thrilled that Dan is here to share with us his thoughts on where we're going with COP21. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please welcome Dr. Dan Reifsnyder.
Well, thank you very much. I love that music. Makes me feel like Rocky or something coming up here. I would just like to say, first of all, thank you, because all of you are involved in the doing of what I'm involved in, the negotiating. And it's very important that there be a close relationship, and I don't have as close a relationship as I would like. So I'm very grateful to be here, very grateful to hear of all the great things happening in the green building sector, and it's crucial to the future. So please know that we're very grateful. Me and all of my colleagues are very grateful to you. COP21 is the 21st session of the Conference of the Parties under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is something that was, of course, negotiated in 1991-92. It was adopted in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit. The United States at that time became the first industrialized country and the fourth country overall to ratify the Framework Convention on Climate Change. But it's been a bit uncertain since, because we had the Kyoto Protocol then in 1997. The United States did not become a party to the Kyoto Protocol, although most other countries did. And we've been embarked, really, this effort goes back, I would say, at least to 2009 in Copenhagen, where the negotiations really began. But officially, they began in Durban in 2011, with creation of this body that John referred to, the Durban Platform on Enhanced Action. It is essentially a negotiating process that was created under the Framework Convention. With the creation of this ad hoc group. It's kind of interesting, though, because while I am one of two co-chairs for this final leg of the journey from Durban, we started out with not a chair. Normally, a negotiating process would have a chair. But in this case, the parties said, no, we don't want to have a chair. We want to have co-chairs. We want to have someone representing the North. We want to have someone representing the South. And so the first pair of co-chairs they chose came from India and Norway. And they ran the process for about a year, year and a half. And then they were substituted out, and we had another pair that came in from Trinidad and Tobago on the one hand, and from the European Commission on the other. And then they exited the stage back in Lima in December of last year, and I came on as the representative of the developed countries, and my colleague, Dr. Ahmed Jogloff, Ambassador Ahmed Jogloff from Algeria, came on as the developing country co-chair. So the two of us have been trying to, as Ahmed puts it, trying to fly this plane, and we will try to land the plane in Paris in about 3 weeks' time. It's a measure, though, I think, of some of the problems that we've faced in this effort. The fact that you have not a chair, but you have co-chairs. The fact that you don't have a single pair of co-chairs. You have people who've been substituted in and out along the way. It's very unusual in terms of an international negotiation to do that. But it's a measure, to some extent, of the anxiety and some of the problems that we've encountered along the way with trust and confidence in the process. In Lima, I want to give you first an idea of what we've been doing and how we've been doing it. To me, this is my normal life. John, I think it's kind of boring, but John assured me you'd find it very interesting, so I hope you will. But I also want to talk about how this relates to the building movement and the building effort, because I see some very positive things on the horizon in this relationship between what we're trying to do in the context of Paris and what you are doing also here. So that will be the second part of what I'm going to say. The first time that Ahmed and I took over, we met in February in Geneva for a week. Our job there was to try to put together a negotiating text. We had to work with a text of some 30 pages that was a list of elements that came from the co-chairs in Lima. No one thought about this very much at the time because they were focused on the decision in Lima that became the big political focus of the effort. So we took over this 30-page text, and we had to sort of figure out how are we going to put together a text that could be circulated to all of the parties, and there are 196 parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, in all UN languages before the beginning of May, which was the requirement from the decision. We spent really just 5 days doing that, and what we did was to take the 30 pages and say, okay, what's not in here that you think has to be in here? And what needs to be added to flesh this out and make this truly a text that reflects your views? And so we walked through the entire 30 pages and calling on different parties. We had 2 rules. The first rule was that you had to speak in the room and say what you wanted to insert. The second rule was that you had to send it electronically to the Secretariat so that we could get it in and make sure we knew that we had it right. We did this, as I say, in 5 days, actually less than 5 days. We did it in about 3 days. And by the end of the time, we had a negotiating text, quote unquote, of some 90 pages in English. In preparing for this session, I just thought it'd be kind of fun to go back and figure out how many pages it was in the other languages. And for example, Spanish was 109, French was 136, Chinese was 120, Arabic was 162, and Russian was 166. So I don't know whether you've been around a negotiation of this magnitude before, but try taking a document of 166 pages or even 90 pages and figuring out where to go with it. It was a great achievement in February because people said, thank God, you know, we have a text. We have something that can be circulated that everyone can see. Here are all the positions of all the countries involved. The problem is it was a compilation of everybody's views. And it was very dense, very difficult to work your way through. In looking through it again in preparation for this session, I think I was stunned that in one case we had, I think, the long-term goal for adaptation to climate change, we had 13 different options that had been put on the table. And in terms of the time frame for the commitments that countries will make, the actions that they will take, we had 12 different options. So just trying to figure out how do you begin to sit down and negotiate with that many options and that many differences. But we had a very good mood, and I think that was very important, and we moved from this very short session in Geneva in February to a much longer session in June, a 2-week session in Bonn. And there, the effort was really to try to streamline and consolidate the text that we have, and to try to take this thing of 90 pages and reduce it in size. We were also trying to eliminate options as we went along. So there wasn't, some people complained, they said, we're not really having an opportunity to negotiate the true issues. We're having to deal with all of these various formulations, but of course, you couldn't even see the issues because you had so much verbiage all around them. By the end of that 2-week period, we had a big success. We reduced the 90 pages to 85. And that was, people were very pleased once again with the mood and the atmosphere, the transparency, the openness, I would say, but everyone was very concerned with the pace of the negotiations and what was going on. Everyone said we really need to speed this up. But one of the most important things I think that came out of that session, in preparation for each of these sessions, Ahmed and I normally do what's known as a scenario note that just sort of orients the parties to the process that we'll be following and what we plan to do over the period of time that we have, how we will organize the work. Attached to the scenario note for that May session, we had a very small, but I think very highly significant annex, which just provided a skeleton of the Paris decision. Because I think in the minds of many people, people saw that Paris will consist of several things. It will consist on the one hand of an agreement, an actual legally binding agreement among the parties. But it will also consist of other things. It will consist of a decision because the agreement has to be adopted by a decision of the parties in Paris. It will also consist of various decision elements that will flesh out the commitments that are contained in the agreement itself. So just as you have a law and you have regulations that interpret that law, you have an agreement and you have decisions that flesh out and provide the detail and the guidance that you wouldn't otherwise put in in an agreement itself. We also have a big effort that was mounted beginning in Durban called Workstream 2 in this process, which is all about ambition in the pre-2020 period. A number of countries, particularly developing countries, particularly island countries and African countries, have said, wait a minute, we have 5 years before this thing is supposed to begin in 2020. We can't afford to lose that time. So we need to have a focus also on ambition in the pre-2020 period leading up to when the agreement is expected to enter into force. We will also have then a work program, because there will be a number of things that will not be decided in Paris. No matter how much goodwill and how quickly we can move, there are things that have to be worked out over time among the parties prior to entry into force of the agreement, and those have to be reflected in a decision. The work program has to be part of that. And then we have administrative and budgetary issues as well. So this was an effort. Putting this little skeleton in as an annex to our scenario note was an effort to try to indicate to people that this is the sum total of what we're looking at. I think at the time, most people thought it was fairly innocuous, and it wasn't designed to be anything but helpful. But when we got to the end of the session in June, parties said, we need help. It was phenomenal that they said that, because in the process, co-chairs have been highly distrusted along the way. We hear very often that this is a party-driven process, that you co-chairs are here to help us facilitate our discussions. You are not to lead or otherwise control what happens, which is fine, except that normally in a negotiation, a chair has a major role of putting proposals together and putting them before the parties and trying to find ways to move forward. So the ability of the co-chairs in this particular negotiation, because of the distrust and the suspicion, has been highly circumscribed for quite a while. And the fact that the parties in June turned to us and said, help us, you know, we need something that will take this further than where we've been, was astounding. I would say a couple other things to point out that were also astounding in this effort. We were able to recruit 11 co-facilitators, people from different delegations that we could rely on to handle, for example, mitigation, adaptation, technology transfer, capacity building, finance, transparency of action and support, and final clauses and so forth, and Workstream 2. We couldn't do it all ourselves, Ahmed and I, so we had to recruit people, and we did that in a very, what I think was a very careful but very balanced way to make sure that we had a very representative set of co-facilitators. I would just tell you that one of the worst problems I had was on Sunday night before we met in Bonn for the first meeting, and one of the groups we were meeting with said, well, you know, we're okay with your idea of having facilitators, but we don't like individual facilitators. We want co-facilitators. And having assembled a group of 11 people very carefully that we thought was very balanced and very well mixed and so forth, I thought, how on earth am I going to find 11 more people by tomorrow morning that we can add to this list? And it was at that point that my colleague Ahmed had just a brilliant idea. I think he's a guy who thinks out of the box a lot. And he said, you know, it's easy. We'll just take our 11 and we'll give them 2 jobs. They can be the main chair on one issue and they can be the alternate on another issue, and we doubled them up and off we went. So it was great, but we've managed to scoot around some of the problems in that way. But the parties accepted the use of facilitators, which was also unusual. They hadn't really been willing in the past to allow us that kind of flexibility. The other thing that we did in June that was very important, and I should highlight this, is that we wanted to have an opportunity for countries who had submitted what we call INDCs, or Intended Nationally Determined Contributions, to the Secretariat to present those publicly. These are essentially the contributions of each party to what we will do about mitigating climate change and perhaps even adapting to climate change and so forth. It's open under the decision from Lima as to what parties include, but by and large, they were intended to reflect what your commitment to addressing this problem in the post-2020 period, either between 2020 and 2025 or 2020 and 2030 would be. But this was also very controversial in Lima because there'd been a strong movement to say we must have a process to look at these things in great depth. And a number of countries said, wait, this is a national commitment that I'm making. It's a sovereign decision, what I'm doing, and I'm not going to subject that to a lot of public scrutiny by other countries telling me how to do things. And this was a great concern in Lima. And as a result, having anything that smacked of what they call ex ante review was highly, highly controversial. So the fact that in June, after all of the controversy we'd had in Lima the year before, we were able to get parties willing to have side events where we could actually have countries come forward and make these presentations was enormous. And we've done that now. What's so important about this is that we have now, I believe it's 162 of these INDCs that have been submitted so far. And they represent about 83% of all of the parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change. So the fact that we have that many countries who have already come forward before Paris even begins to say, here is my contribution, here is what I'm going to do, here is what I can contribute to this problem is incredible. It's especially incredible because one of the things that has bedeviled these negotiations for years has been the issue of what we call common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. That is essentially the notion that developed countries must take the lead, developed countries must go first, because they are the ones who are responsible for the largest set of emissions in the world. That was one thing in 1992, of course, and it's quite a different thing in 2015. In 1992, the United States was the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. By this year, China is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. The whole mosaic has changed dramatically. The gains that have come in developing countries have been very significant and very important as they develop. So that it's no longer the case that you have just a set of industrialized countries and a set of developing countries and never the twain shall meet. What we've been working on is to try to find a way to move forward collectively as a human community, recognizing that some will do more and some will do less based on their capabilities, but a way that we can move forward together to address this issue of climate change. That is essentially the primary objective and the main goal of the agreement that we're negotiating in Paris, is to try to build this new system in which everyone will take part and everyone will make a contribution. I should just quickly run through some of the things that then have happened, because after the session in June, Ahmed and I sat down with this annex that I mentioned, and we said we would be happy to help the parties to streamline and consolidate and reduce options, but in addition, we needed to take all of this massive verbiage and begin to organize it into sections. What would be in an agreement? What would be in a decision? What would be the other pieces that we couldn't quite figure out what to do with, and how should those be treated? So what we did was to divide it up, and we started putting things into an agreement. People said, well, what will you put in an agreement? What would go into an agreement versus a decision? We said, well, for example, you don't have final clauses, entry into force matters and so forth in a decision. Those are all part of an agreement. And you don't have a work program that leads to entry into force of the agreement. In the agreement, you have that in a decision. So those were fairly easy to explain to people, but there were a lot of other issues that were very controversial. And people said, well, everybody wanted to see his or her own most important issues in the agreement, not in a decision, because they felt that's where the political attention would be paid. So we did this. We developed something we called the co-chairs tool, and we presented it a month before the meeting that we had at the end of August, also in Bonn. And it was extremely controversial at the time, because people said, well, wait a minute, I don't necessarily agree with how you've allocated these things to this basket or that basket, and we want to take all of the things that you've left in this part 3, which is the issues where we couldn't make decisions about where they should go. We thought there should be more negotiation among the parties. We had a lot of remonstrating about those kinds of issues. But we got to the end of that session in Bonn at the end of August, beginning of September, and we had done some good work. I think parties were beginning to coalesce, but once again, the distance between where we were at that time and where we had to go to have an agreement and a decision in Paris that makes sense and can be adopted and be acceptable to 196 parties was very, very wide. And so at that time, the parties asked us once again to please help us and come forward with something. They said we need a step change in these negotiations. And so from the 4th of September when we ended until the 5th of October, when we put out this document, Ahmed and I worked very diligently, also with the co-chairs or the co-facilitators and with the two presidencies, both the Peruvians and the French, to try to develop a text. It was our text, the co-chairs text, but it was a text that we put forward on our own responsibility as a non-paper, as a way to help parties move forward. Now, I should just tell you, if you recall that I said we started with 90 pages, our text in October was 9 pages of the agreement, and the decision text was 11 pages. And it was radical, I have to say. It was quite dramatic, but it also, I think what was most important is that it gave parties a clear idea of what an agreement would look like and what a decision could look like. I said when we started in October, because we had another negotiating session that ran from the 19th of October to the 23rd, I said when I introduced this, I said, well, all of you have said that you like 3 things about our text. You like the brevity, you like the clarity, and you like the structure. But that's about where happiness ends. Because I think to a party, they all said, we don't like your text. It's very prejudicial. None of the points that are important to us are reflected in this text. We need to rebalance it. We need to have an opportunity to add to it, which we fully expected and we fully anticipated. I think what we didn't anticipate is that some parties said, no, your text is so prejudicial that we can't even begin with this text. So we had a bit of drama in the first few days trying to move forward and trying to have a basis that we could use. At the end of the day, we were able to do that. We were able to have the parties meet in the groups and work this out so that we emerged from that session with a text that the parties all now own. It is about 55 pages long, just the agreement part of it. No, I should say the whole thing is about 55 pages. But it is at least something that the parties themselves feel they own. We were convinced at the time, at least I should say I was convinced at the time, that what we needed for Paris would be one more text and one more session. And frankly, it came as a great shock to me that at the end of the day in Bonn, we ended up with no agreement for another session before Paris and no agreement on another text. So we will have a lot of work to do in Paris beginning on the 30th of November because we will have 1 week of ADP, that's the group that Ahmed and I are chairing, which will then end on Saturday the 5th of December. And then this will be passed off to the French presidency, which it will be France's responsibility as president of the COP to ultimately land the agreement and the decision. And this is going to be, I think it's a cliffhanger right now, frankly. I think we are well positioned. We have enormous support from countries around the world. Everybody wants to have an agreement. Everybody wants a successful outcome. And everybody wants an ambitious agreement. But how to translate that into the reality of what we're facing is a very complicated task. And as I say, just to remind you of the issues that we're addressing, the Durban platform called for work in 6 different areas. It called for work on mitigation. Mitigation is essentially what countries are going to do to reduce, avoid, or sequester their greenhouse gas emissions. It called for work on adaptation, which is trying to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change, which are already being experienced by countries around the world, including this country. It's a difficult thing because I think there's been a feeling under the Framework Convention for years that the focus has been on mitigation and not on adaptation, and that adaptation is becoming critical to many countries, and particularly to developing countries who don't have the infrastructure and the means to adapt to some of these changes. So that one of the great efforts in this negotiation has been to put mitigation and adaptation on more of a par, so that they're more equal. And there's been a decision with respect to the Green Climate Fund to allocate 50% of the funds on a grant or equivalent basis to adaptation and 50% to mitigation. So there's increasing recognition of the importance of this. But another key area then is finance, and I mentioned the Green Climate Fund. It's quite interesting because there have been a number of developments related to this. Most important, I think, was the commitment that developed countries made in Copenhagen in 2009 to provide $100 billion to address climate change by 2020. And so the effort under this, and of course that's by 2020, and so developing countries have been saying, well, that's fine, but where's the money and how are you going to get there? What counts as part of this 100 billion? We've had an agreement that also grew out of Copenhagen to establish a green climate fund, which has now been set up in Songdo, Korea. And not only has it been set up, but pledges were made last year totaling $10.2 billion for the first period. And in addition, just a few weeks ago, we had the first set of projects approved by the Green Climate Fund. So this is a bit unusual in a negotiation. Normally, you're arguing about money and you're arguing about whether to create a fund. In this case, as I was saying, this is a very unusual negotiation because the agreement on setting up a fund came in Copenhagen 6 years ago. And they've actually set up the fund and they've capitalized the fund and they're giving money to projects now under the fund. So you say, well, where's the negotiation then if everything's been done? Well, that's the 10.2 billion, but we have a pledge of 100 billion by 2020. And developing countries are saying, where's the difference? What do we see? And much of that, this was not a pledge for 100 billion in public sector funds. It was a pledge in 100 billion public and private in the context of meaningful action on adaptation and mitigation. So there is a lot of work to do, but there's a lot of concern on the part of developing countries about where is the difference and how will that be made up. There's a question about what will happen in the post-2020 period then. If this is to 2020, what happens post-2020? There's been a lot of discussion about whether there should be any kind of a number or not, because some people say, well, how can we know what the donor pool will be post-2020? And how can we know what the recipient pool will be post-2020? Because the world is changing dramatically, and we may have a wider base of donors, we may have a smaller base of recipients, and what amount of funding is going to be necessary to undertake the actions that we will identify by that time is really not clear. But, so there are a lot of issues surrounding the issue of finance in these negotiations. And then we have the issues of technology transfer, a perennial issue that's been, I think, very well handled so far under the Framework Convention, but there's still issues there to be worked out. We also have capacity building, which is a huge area, particularly as developing countries are stepping up and taking on actions to address climate change themselves. They need help in being technical expertise and other kinds of help to try to take on these efforts. And so there's been a great deal of focus and a great deal of recognition that capacity building will be key to the future. And that's another piece of the Durban platform. And finally, one of the most important is the issue of transparency of action and support. It's critical. I think countries are willing to take action, but they all want to know that other people are acting too. And the only way that they can know that the efforts they're making and the contributions they're making are being met by others is with a very transparent and very clear system in which people are reporting periodically on what they're doing, and this is being measured and counted and aligned. And that's been, but developing countries have said, well, wait a minute, it's not just transparency of action, it's also transparency of support. We want to know where this money is coming from and who's getting it and what they're doing with it and so forth. So there's been agreement that we should focus on both of those. And I should also mention the issue, I shouldn't leave this one, the issue of loss and damage, which has been fairly controversial. But a number of countries, particularly developing countries, have said, wait a minute, you know, there are aspects of the impacts of climate change to which we cannot adapt. And what will happen to us if we have losses and damages that arise from those? And how will those be dealt with? And what kinds of mechanisms and vehicles are available to try to address those concerns? And so that has been also an issue in these negotiations. I just want to give you a flavor of the different issue areas that we've been dealing with, because it's pretty complicated. But let me try to turn, I'm conscious of the time here too, to try to say that these INDCs that have been submitted thus far, I mean, I'm sure many of you have read about this in the news. There was an analysis done by the Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat that tried to indicate what they add up to. In other words, if the goal under this agreement is going to be to try to hold the global temperature increase to below 2 degrees centigrade, or below 1.5 degrees centigrade, as a number of parties have argued, how are we doing against that goal? Well, the INDCs, according to the best analysis, will put us on a 2.7 degree, in a 2.7 degree world by the end of the century. So it's going to be very clear that more action is needed. And that is why what people are looking at under this agreement is the process we will follow going forward. On a periodic basis, we will be looking at the commitments that countries have made, and countries will have an opportunity to make further commitments and go farther and do more. And the question is, how will that process unfold? And when will it unfold? Will it happen every 10 years or every 5 years? Will it happen with the participation of all countries or only some of them? How will these commitments be reflected and so forth? So these are some of the issues that we're also trying to deal with in that context. I mentioned that I see some things on the horizon that I think are very positive, particularly for buildings and for what you're trying to do here. And that is, I just want to relate something that happened in the Major Economies Forum, which is an organization that the United States started a number of years ago. A Major Economies Forum brings together 17 of the largest countries in the world, both developed and developing. And it's been a place where countries could talk in a very frank way at a very senior level. The people who attend the MEF are leaders' representatives. They could talk in a very frank way at a very senior level about the problems that we face in the negotiations and how to identify landing zones, how to find ways around some of the most thorny issues that we face. So everyone acknowledges that the MEF has been very helpful and effective in that way. It doesn't negotiate, but it explores areas of common ground. And it's very important to have those kinds of frank discussions at that level among those countries in particular. But people also said, well, wait a minute, you know, these countries are both the funders of technology and technological R&D. They're the incubators and inventors of technology, and they are the people who are the markets for technology going forward. So if they have a comparative advantage in any area, it is certainly with regard to technology development and cooperation. And so shouldn't the MEF try to explore what could be done among this set of countries? And there was a lot of agreement among MEF countries to go down this road and begin exploring that. And you'd be interested, I think, that the very first area MEF countries settled on as one they should explore was buildings. Because buildings are critical. I mean, we heard Bob tell us at the outset, buildings are critical not only in developed countries, but also in developing countries. And the growth is fastest in the developing world. And there's been a tremendous amount of interest in buildings, but we ran into a number of problems in the MEF. I'm sure you who work in buildings know these very well. I could start, for example, with building codes. Building codes are local or regional in most cases, and they don't change very often or very fast. And so building codes sort of represented a bit of an obstacle for people. Another problem that they faced was the issue of geography, because countries are situated differently in terms of geography and what they worry about. Northern countries tend to worry about heating. Southern countries tend to worry about air conditioning. Temperate countries worry about both, but lighting and so forth. So it's very difficult to coalesce around the nature of the problem if people are having different kinds of problems and different kinds of issues. But then we have the issue of fuel source as well, because you care a lot about the envelope of the building. If you live in the north and you're trying to economize your greenhouse gas emissions by reducing your use of fossil fuels. But if you're generating power from nuclear energy, for example, it's not that big a deal. So this is a problem, I think, that the MEF faced broadly, that all countries face in trying to figure out what kind of an initiative they could mount. But in addition, because the MEF is a leaders' representative forum, and any initiative that came out of the MEF would likely be a leaders' initiative, which is also important because it's only leaders within governments who can reach across the different ministries and across the different lines of activity and really build the kind of coalition that's needed to address building issues. It has to come from the leader level. It can't be the Minister of Environment or the Minister of Foreign Affairs or the Minister of Water, for example. It has to be a leader who has all of those portfolios. And to have an initiative like that, normally you have to have a goal. You have to have something dramatic, something big, something that is leader-like. if people are going to do it. Well, the problem there is, as we're marching toward the Paris Agreement, or the Copenhagen Agreement before that, if you say we have a common goal that applies to everyone, and we will all work together toward this common goal, that could be seen to undercut your negotiating position if you're saying, wait a minute, I'm a developing country, I shouldn't have to do as much as you're doing. You know, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities and so forth, again. And so, to my mind, I think that we had, one of the problems we faced in trying to mount an initiative on buildings was the fact that we were in a period of negotiation where this issue of common but differentiated was central, and where people were concerned that, you know, working too cooperatively together might be seen to undercut your negotiating position. But the good news is, I believe that if we are able to square that circle in Paris with this new agreement, people will be much more relaxed in the future, and I think the opportunities for working together, perhaps in the MEF and perhaps in other areas as well, will be much greater, because I think those issues will be more in the rearview mirror, and we'll be working in a much more collegial and cooperative way going forward in the future. So to me, that's one of the great promises of this agreement for Paris in the future. So that's what I wanted to say this afternoon in a nutshell, I hope. I hope I have kept you awake. I don't see too many people nodding off here, but and we had said, John and I at the outset, that we'd be happy to answer a few questions if there are some. So thank you very much. I remember there were those who told us this year that it would be very important for us to wrap up these negotiations in October because leaders did not want to have the uncertainty of coming to Paris without having the agreement all finished off. And I remember at the time I just kind of smiled because I've been around this process, I say since before there was a process. I got involved with the climate issue in 1989. And to me, it's a lot like the Super Bowl, you know? Don't turn off the TV set before the last 2 minutes, because that's when there's a lot of drama, you know. And I would just say, stay tuned. As I said, we, the ADP, will meet and will be negotiating these issues for about a week in Paris. And then there will be this handoff to the French presidency. And I would say that it's been a very cooperative partnership that France and Peru have had. Peru was president last year, France is president this year. Morocco will be president next year because the COP next year will be in Marrakesh. And the French and the Peruvians have been working very closely together, also with Ahmed and me, and also with the co-facilitators. And so that's very good, very harmonious, but there will be a handoff, and there will be then ministers from different countries that the French probably asked to handle this issue or that issue, and the negotiations will continue. But the goal is to have this done at 6 p.m. on December 11th, period.
If you have questions, there's a mic here and one over there.
I was just wondering what we as individuals can do to support your efforts.
Well, I think you are doing it. I think you are here, you're working in this area that is 40%, as John and I were talking before coming in today, 40% of energy is buildings. And it's not, as much as I'd like to think what I'm doing is critical to the world, what's critical to the world is what you're doing, because that's what is going to make a difference. That's what's going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and economize on energy and make the world a better place. It's the doing of it that is so critical. And
I was just wondering what we can do for your efforts in Paris in the next 3 weeks.
Well, you know, as I say, support us. Let people know you're paying attention. There are still people who don't believe that this is a problem. I was reading in the Post today stories of people who question why we're doing this and what we're doing. I think you can have an influence in speaking with people about the issue.
Okay, a different type of question. You talked about the $100 billion that's needed for the fund, and there's a massive gap. And you talked about the fact that business can possibly make contributions. Well, there's an expectation that business will also make contributions to this green fund. How do they do that? How is the business contribution measured? I mean, there's business people in the room here, so what is their role in achieving that $100 billion target for the Green Fund?
Well, the countries have contributed to the Green Climate Fund. As I said, they made pledges already of $10.2 billion. And those pledges presumably will continue over time. They depend on appropriations. They depend on appropriations here from Congress. It's very important that those appropriations come through because the credibility of each country is at stake. This is all about building mutual trust among countries of the world. And I think one way we can do that, I mean, obviously involving the private sector is going to be critical because we will not get anywhere near the $100 billion that people have talked about without a significant amount of that coming from the private sector in the form of investment and loans and that kind of thing. But the public sector money is quite critical because it is very much a symbol of the commitment of developed countries to assisting developing countries.
Hi there. On that note, obviously, I'm not used to this. In international relations, there's issues with enforcement and sovereignty. How are the mechanisms in this agreement tracking towards further enforcement or addressing obvious issues of sovereignty that are raised, especially here in the US?
Well, it's a good question. I think that we've had a series of efforts under the Framework Convention on Climate Change that have been what I would refer to as top-down, where, for example, under the Kyoto Protocol, there were a certain number of countries, industrialized countries, who had targets for reducing their greenhouse gas emissions in the first commitment period under that agreement, which was 2008 to 12. The problem with this top-down approach was several-fold. First of all, that these things were they were negotiated, they weren't necessarily nationally determined. And they weren't determined, you had a small subset of countries taking on those kinds of commitments under Kyoto. We all know that that subset of countries could reduce their emissions to zero in the world, and it wouldn't solve the problem. We need a global effort. We need a way for all countries to engage. And I think the genius of this negotiation thus far has been the embrace of the bottom-up approach in these intended nationally determined contributions, because this is a way of encouraging everyone to come forward, as we're seeing now with 162 parties who've submitted INDCs of what they can do. Now, people will look at that as they have, and they've said, well, that's great, but that isn't enough. If science is telling us we need to stay below 2 degrees centigrade, and at least 2 degrees centigrade, and we're at 2.7 by the end of the century, then more will have to be done. I think everyone acknowledges that, everyone recognizes that, but the point is to start. And the point is to create a process where you can build these commitments over time in line with the science and so forth. Now, what kind of enforcement mechanisms and so forth? It's very difficult to think about enforcing a nationally determined contribution. I mean, because the people who are making this contribution are saying, this is what I will do. You can't hold them to account in the international arena. It's very difficult to do that, or they will cease to make those kinds of commitments, perhaps, if they feel that this is going to be, it's nationally determined, but only up to the point where they introduce it, and thereafter it becomes something that can be enforced by others. So my sense is that we're going to see an enforcement regime under this agreement that's going to be much more facilitative, much more the kind of thing where if countries are having problems taking actions and having problems doing things, they will receive assistance from other countries to help them come into compliance, because everybody wants to comply with the commitments that he has made. We've seen this, for example, and John mentioned earlier the Montreal Protocol. Montreal Protocol is a very good example of this, because you have in the Montreal Protocol the possibility of trade sanctions against countries who don't comply. Now, that's been very controversial under the Montreal Protocol, and it frankly has been used almost never. Because the way we deal with compliance issues under the Montreal Protocol is when there's a compliance problem, we go to the country, the party involved, and we say, why haven't you been able to comply? And we talk about their problems. We try to find ways to help bring them back into compliance that are facilitative and not punitive. And I think that kind of regime is what we're headed for, in my own sense, under this agreement.
I have a question regarding social and economic equity. I can foresee underdeveloped countries being forced, if they are signatory to this agreement, to forego removal of their one and only wealth, which is natural resources that's in the ground. And I'm just wondering how this agreement will help these countries to be compensated economically and socially for this, because there's, I sense, an inherent built-in inequity in this agreement.
Well, let me say that I think the equity comes from the notion that these are intended nationally determined contributions. So no country is going to commit to doing something that would be not in that country's interest. And it's certainly in all countries' interest to develop and to grow and to provide for their populations. I don't think anyone is denying that. The issue is how you do that, and can you do that in ways that minimize your greenhouse gas emissions, for example, and that also increase resilience and your ability to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change, which are already here and we're already going to have to confront. So equity is a critical piece of this, but I think the most important way we're going to end up dealing with the equity issue is that no country will do more than it feels it legitimately can. And coming back to this issue of, well, how do you enforce that? We're going to have a very public process in which people will look at periodic intervals at what other countries are doing. And it's the public reaction to this. It's I noticed someone from WRI was here coming in today. There are a number of organizations that are doing analyses of what these add up to on the part of countries, and these are public analyses so that every country is in a kind of a glass house, a kind of crucible with respect to what it's doing. And that's the arena where I think the pressure grows to do more. It's not because someone comes at you and says, I'm going to enforce trade sanctions if you don't do this. It's that you're putting forward a contribution, and people around the world are judging, is that sufficient? Should we be doing more? Should this country or that country or others be doing more? And it's that kind of public process that is going to lead, I think, to increase the pressure for action over time, consistent with the science.
I had a question around carbon trading. Considering the positive developments of carbon trading schemes nationally and regionally, and challenges of the CDM, how do you see carbon trading playing a role in the New Deal in Paris?
Well, it's very interesting because that issue has also been pretty controversial. There are many, many countries who think that the use of market instruments is something that's going to be quite important to the future. Already, you know, China is experimenting with regionally and with cities, I think in 7 or 8 different areas, and they intend to have a national system next year, as I understand it, for emissions trading in China. Europe has an emissions trading system as well. It's interesting because today, under the system we have where each country is putting forward an intended nationally determined contribution, you can use market instruments if you want right now because there's nothing to say you can't. The issue is, will we have something in the agreement that either acknowledges or endorses the use of market instruments? And that's where we run into some issues because there are some countries who feel that it is simply wrong to what I say, hypothecate your natural resources, to subject your natural resources to a trading system. And they are very opposed to the use of market instruments. And that's been a real sticking point in these negotiations for a long time, despite the fact that under the regime that we have now, people can, and in some cases are using market instruments. So I don't have a clear answer for you on how this will be resolved in Paris, but my belief is that it will not go away. It's going to be part of the future. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to be with you today.
Dan, thank you so much for sharing your insights on the process, and please know that our community stands fully committed to support a successful outcome. Before we move on to networking, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of the speakers and participants in today's sessions, both in the morning and afternoon. We greatly appreciate everything that you've contributed to this dialogue and our objectives. We stand to learn a lot today, and as we listen to others facing challenges similar to our own and finding new ways of embracing change and driving growth, we can be empowered to do the same. I hope you all find this afternoon's sessions valuable. I thank you again for joining us and your time for being with us today.